welcome to Stork'd the podcast, in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is Julia, and I have to tell you, this is one of the hardest episodes I have yet to record. I want to introduce you to Amanda, and due to the timing in which this event occurred, right in the middle of a COVID vaccine debate, when everyone was locked in their homes and people were at war with one another about whether vaccines were acceptable, appropriate, medically necessary. I mean, you remember the time. I don't need to articulate it to you. In the middle of that, Amanda loses a child, and she is a researcher who specializes in medical statistics and happens to write an article about vaccines. And as a result, somebody takes her article and her post that she's recently lost her baby, puts the two together, and it becomes fuel for the anti-vaccine debate. This includes people attacking Amanda and her family and telling her that it was her fault that her baby died. I just want you to imagine that for a second. I don't care what side of the debate you are on regarding vaccines. I don't care what opinion you have. I want you to imagine losing a child, which is the most heart-wrenching and horrible experience anyone can go through, and having complete strangers attack you on social media, blame you, and to feel like your life and your family's life is at risk because they might be able to find you and find your home and come get you. Just pause and sit with that for a second. I mean, the tears that well up inside me when I think about this experience of losing a child, of being under attack, of knowing with certainty that you didn't cause this, and yet having to defend yourself to strangers is the most horrific thing I think anyone can go through. I highly encourage you to listen to this episode. I can promise you it's not going to be easy, but it's important. It's important for us to think about how we treat one another, even when we agree or disagree with them. It's important to think about the role social media plays. It's important to think about the role statistics, data analysis, and medicine play in our lives today. And it's also important to think that underneath all of those things is human experience and how painful it is to lose somebody. I can't do this story justice. You are definitely going to hear me cry a little bit in the episode, and I really hope you take a listen, enjoy it, share it. It's important. And don't forget to share Stork'd generally with any friends and loved ones. Here is Amanda. Well, Amanda, thank you so much for joining us at Stork'd the podcast. This is the podcast in which we explore the many ways to build and define and talk about family. And we're here to talk about just a lot of things. There's just so much to cover. So let's start with a warm, hearty welcome, and we'll go from there.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. Would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and how your family is currently composed?
Sure. So I am based in Washington, D.C. I've lived here for 12 years, which maybe makes me a local at this point, the better part of my adult life. I live with my partner, my husband, James, and along with my toddler and my little Shiba Inu puppy. So there are 4 of us, 3 humans, 1 puppy, cohabitating in our nice little DC townhouse. I have a background in public health. So I worked in public health and international development for the better part of 8 years, focusing on data and data visualization before moving into working in tech for 5 years and now working for myself. So I went independent back in March of this year and also spent part of my time running a global professional nonprofit for data biz people. So I love the work that I do. I love getting to stay connected to the data viz community and to my professional roots, but also really loving the fact that I get to spend more time with my toddler. And on days when our nanny has to take a day off or something like that, I've been able to get in a little bit more quality time, which has been really nice for me. And I cherish for a lot of reasons that I may not have even a year ago. And I know we'll dive into that in different ways.
We definitely will. And one of the things I want to highlight is that among many, many, many other things that you've just mentioned, you've been one of the people that's been helping the world, in particular the US, make sense of COVID data by helping it be visual, by helping it be concrete, by helping it be easily digestible for the average consumer. Is that a fair assessment of kind of the work that you do?
You always want to think that you're helping people make more sense of that information. I think that one of the challenges we've seen with COVID is the rapid speed with which we can access information, whether it's data or stories or anecdotes or other things that might influence our decision-making and choices. Early on in the pandemic, I wrote a lot about the complexities of the case data because I remember the days when I would get phone calls from people saying, I'm looking at these numbers on the New York Times site every 2 hours and they're changing. And should I do something differently? And the question I always asked back was, is the kind of hour by hour change in these numbers really going to change your behavior and the choices you make about kind of prevention and community spread and everything else? And so I started writing a lot about the importance of being mindful of how that data gets collected, the uncertainty and incompleteness in those data sets, and how that data gets collected varies across different countries, since I have roots in looking at health information systems in different countries around the world. Talking about the fact that kind of how quickly we might have case information in South Africa, where data gets collected with a digital app, is different from having it get reported up to the CDC by state governments here in the States. And so I worked really hard to try to put a lot of that information out there.
Yeah. And one of the things you and I share is that we were both pregnant in the middle of the pandemic. And I remember, if I'm going back to my feeling state, I remember just being absolutely terrified because I didn't understand the data and I didn't understand what I could or couldn't do as a general person. And then as a pregnant person, like it was just really baffling to try and make the best decisions I could with the information I had on hand. Were you, even as a data scientist and a data viz person, were you also navigating this, like, what do I do? How do I keep myself and my family safe question?
So I did dig in a lot around what the different risks were around pregnancy for me, both before I was vaccinated and then after, because I got vaccinated midway through my pregnancy last year. And thinking about kind of what I could do to minimize risk for me and my family. I mean, I think part of that was colored both by being pregnant and higher risk, also by having a toddler at the time, a small child who wouldn't be vax eligible, now we know, for at least another year. And I'm also the daughter of a transplant patient. And so I think a lot from a personal perspective around the ways in which doing seemingly small things that prevent community spread through a public health lens really have a personal impact on the health and safety of people like my dad. And so I thought a lot about those kind of personal constraints and caveats and spent a lot of time sitting with the data. My husband might say a bit too much in terms of racking up my own anxiety about different things. But it did help me to make sense of the fact that there was a lot of data and information being collected and put out there. And for me, that's reassuring.
Yeah. So we're really diving deep into your job. And what I want to just distill is I'm hearing that you're an expert at helping us understand really complicated information when there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of information that's coming at you and maybe changing, and that your job is to help make sense of that, help to make it clear. And yet there are some things that are just nonsensical, and you lived through one of those. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience, frankly, with infant loss and with losing your son? That's a really hard way to start the conversation.
It's okay. Is there an easy way to start a conversation?
There isn't. And, this is the second infant loss conversation I've had for the sake of this podcast. And I just am so unskilled at broaching the subject. So I'm going to apologize in advance because it's a hard one.
And we're also just not equipped well to talk about in the US. It's something I've learned a lot. And I mean, I can talk about things now that I couldn't talk about 6 months ago without breaking down in tears, right? So I think that there are things that change day by day and month by month and week by week for lost parents too. But I would say one of the hardest things as a lost parent, before we dive into kind of my specific experience, has always been when people use their own discomfort as a reason not to talk about it. And I think that that's something that's really important. Is I promise you that, like, when people bring up my son, who I lost last year, I think sometimes people worry that they're reminding you of something bad that happened and they'll upset you or something, they'll make you feel worse. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't think about my son. I mean, I have pictures of him around my house. I'm sitting in what was his nursery right now with like the same pictures that are on the wall and his handprint sitting back behind me on the wall and things like that. And so it brings me joy to have people remember that he's here, because it's one of the weirdest things about a pandemic loss pregnancy is no one really saw me pregnant for the duration of my pregnancy, as life was lived on Zoom and we weren't traveling or anything else. And so no one really saw me pregnant. Very few people met my son, Xander, my second born son. And so when he passed away in September of last year, just shy of 3 months old, there was a very narrow group of people who'd never actually spent time with him. He never met any of my husband's siblings or my siblings, like any of his aunts and uncles. And so it's just a very strange thing to feel sometimes like a year of your life just kind of got disappeared away. But I mean, it very much was for us. It was for his older brother, who was 2.5 at the time when he lost his brother. And so I think that one of the important things I would reinforce for folks is that I promise you that anyone you know who's lost a child, whether it's through infant loss or through miscarriage or stillbirth, like we think about them all the time. And the hardest thing is when people don't acknowledge it. So I appreciate the apology, but I think I also appreciate you making space and talking about these kind of stories and things because they are uncomfortable.
They are uncomfortable. So I'm going to put a disclaimer out there. This is something I never do. And I'm going to say I am exceedingly uncomfortable right now. And usually when I'm in the interview seat, I feel confident that I'm helping extract a story that's important for people to hear. But this story is hard. And so let me own why it's hard. And then maybe you can tell me how you like people to approach. Let me ask that question. How do you like people to approach the conversation? Acknowledging that talking about it is important because it helps keep the memory alive, and acknowledge, frankly, that you've been through something really, really tough. Is there an okay way to start the conversation? How would you have liked me to open the dialogue?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And one that's tricky, I think, too, in situations like this, where we talked in advance about having a conversation about this hard topic, right? That's different than me seeing a friend. I mean, and in pandemic times, seeing a friend maybe for the first time in 6 months who's never met my son, and like that whole period of my life just kind of disappeared. I think for me, what's most helpful is when people are direct about it, but that might not be what's most helpful for everyone, right? So for me, if someone says, I just want to really acknowledge that we haven't seen each other since you had and lost your son, and I just want to check in and just kind of say I'm really sorry, or I've been thinking about you and your family, or something like that, without any expectation of a response. And I think that's the important piece, is leaving the open door that if someone wants to take that time to talk about it and say, yeah, this has been really hard. These are the things I've been thinking about a lot, or these are the memories I want to share. It's hard because even the questions that I think sometimes you see on kind of grief posts and Instagrams and things about like, ask them for a happy memory, which I think is a really nice and kind thing to do, can sometimes in certain moments just feel like so much pressure to like find that one happy memory that's going to embody like your entire child's 3-month long stay here in the world. And that can feel really hard, but some days that can feel really good to talk about. So I think the hardest piece is that there's never going to be a perfect answer to it. And my brother's gone through a really significant loss with a partner in the past. And he used to just tell me sometimes that questions I asked were stupid. And the one that he told me was stupid the most often was, how are you? How are you? Like, how are you? Especially in the month or so after that really significant loss. And the answer is just like, terrible. I'm just terrible. There's no good answer. And so we shifted over to just asking like, how are you today? And putting a finite time box on it actually helped a lot. And I think sometimes even just helps a lot now as we're approaching new milestones in our family and kind of grappling with coming up on the anniversary of my son's loss. We've gone through the anniversary of what would have been his first birthday, and going through those things. And sometimes just people asking like, how are you today is a really nice thing.
So how are you today?
Okay. I'm feeling very round. I'm currently expecting another baby. So I'm a couple weeks out from delivering another baby. So I think that that's been a both pleasant distraction in some ways, but also a physical imposition on my body, as anyone I think who's been pregnant and gone through that last month knows, that you end up getting to a place where your kind of speed of movement is a slow waddle, I would describe myself at this point. But doing okay. I think one of the hardest things that we'll have is that the anniversary of my son's death is going to come less than 2 weeks after I give birth to a new baby. So the idea that I'm going to be having another child before I've even been a year without the one that I lost is hard. And I think there's a certain amount of just paralysis thinking about knowing what postpartum hormones feel like, having gone through this before. Like, what is it going to be like to go through what the women who are in my group therapy group and who have also gone through these kind of anniversaries and loss and everything else, what is that going to be like? And how do I set myself up? Success is the wrong word, but set myself up so that I can manage my way through that period. And one of the things that I found is helpful for me is just to create space that I can be however I need to be. I mean, I think I spent half of the week before Xander's first birthday, or what would have been his first birthday, laying on the floor crying, and finally unpacking and reorganizing like chores in his nursery for new baby sister that's arriving, and just deciding that I was going to sink into the sadness a lot. And that's what I needed, but I needed the space to just do that by myself. And sometimes you need the company. And so I think that it's always hard to predict what's going to help and what's going to make things harder.
And it's amazing. We're having this conversation in the same week that is National Rainbow Baby Day, meaning that there is a lot of Instagram, social media, and news articles about acknowledging that some people have infant loss and that sometimes there's a baby that comes afterwards. I've never been in your shoes, but I would imagine that when you're pregnant and going through the milestones, particularly when the timelines align, meaning that the birth dates were similar time periods in the seasons, were you reflecting, okay, this time last year I was pregnant with, or a year and a half ago, I was pregnant with Xander and we were doing this, and, this last August, I was doing this. Are you kind of in that headspace, that comparison headspace, or does this feel totally different?
Some days there are activities or things that you find symbolism in. I mean, in 3 months of time in a pandemic, we didn't do a lot of outings as a family with him last year, but we went out there's a sunflower field outside of DC that has a whole bunch of fun, like farm equipment toddler can climb on and stuff like that. And we went out there to go see the sunflowers this year, which we had done with him twice because my toddler really loved the farm equipment. More so than the flowers. Let me tell you that I was glad we discovered the tractors after the flowers, because there was no way that we would have ever made it out into the sunflower fields last year otherwise. But we had done that. And I think that those kind of moments where you're back in a space where you feel like you should have a 1-year-old with you and you don't are hard. It's also a space that my other child finds a lot of joy in. And I think there's a lot to be said for celebrating and helping him keep that memory. He remembers Xander going with him out to visit the sunflowers. He remembers Xander going with him to go to the lake and go on the boat. He talks about him all the time. And so I think sometimes you kind of find ways to hope that you can keep some of those memories alive for someone who was so young when that happened, and knowing that some of that will probably fade, especially as a new baby comes into our life. So I think that that's been a big piece of kind of figuring out where that balance is and what that looks like. I mean, kids, as I understand from the therapy work I've done, don't entirely understand life and death until they're 5 or 6, usually. And so we get to keep revisiting what that loss looks like for our child, which is another, for the child we still have, which is another kind of layer of grief that we get to work through. And it's one that we try to model and let him have whatever feelings he has. My husband and I both cry in front of him sometimes, and for seemingly no apparent reason. And we talk about it. And I think that those are all really important things to let him have the feelings that he needs and wants to feel in relation to that loss that he just doesn't have words for. And I sometimes think that we don't give kids enough credit. I think they feel those kind of losses deeply and just don't always have the words to explain them. So back to your original question on the overlapping pieces, I think a lot of what I experience and see ends up being a lot through kind of his perspective and thinking about how I can support him and kind of keep some of those memories alive, a little bit less so than it has been for me in terms of the pregnancy over the course of the past, now just over 9 months.
Yeah. You actually anticipated my next question. And so, which was to say, it's not just your loss, it's a loss shared by your husband and shared by your baby, your first son. And so one of my questions was, how do you talk to a very small child about grief, about loss, about death? It sounds like you do it quite openly. Would you be willing to model for me, what does a sentence or conversation with your older son look like?
The language we use a lot is really direct. We talk about how Xander's body stopped working and he died and that he can't come back. We talk about that a lot. Sometimes he understands that more than other times. I know on his birthday, at the end of having decorations up and having a cake that Caspian stacked full of Legos because it didn't have enough sprinkles on it and needed Legos, he asked me if this meant that Xander was coming home because we were celebrating his birthday. So you have moments like that you're like, oh, this is still something that he's thinking about a lot in a different way than I had realized. But all the advice we've had has always been to use very direct language, not to use metaphors like went to sleep or something else that might be fearful for him. And we've talked a lot about kind of what we can do with baby sister. And I'm going to go to the hospital and they're going to take baby sister out of my belly and we're going to be able to meet her and see her. And he hasn't had a lot of experience with hospitals, but one of the only ones he does is when Xander went in an ambulance to a hospital and never came back. And so we've talked with him about like if he wants to come to the hospital, as much as it wouldn't be my COVID safe approach to new sibling introduction. But if like the same day, if I'm doing okay and baby's doing okay and he wants to come to the hospital, how do we create space for that so that we make sure that he feels reassured that mom and baby are okay as long as everything goes well? So we use a lot of really direct language. And I think we say more times than I wish we had to, like, no, remember baby Xander's body stopped working and he died. So he can't come back. We can remember him. And the other day he found a Sharpie marker, which is never advisable with a toddler in your house. No. To realize there's a black Sharpie marker somewhere. We found a Sharpie marker and he picked it up in the morning. It was like 6:30. And he decided to draw his own approximation of a C and a Z on his 2 fingers and had clearly just been thinking about Xander a lot. And he said, I really want to rememorialize him, which is the word he used. But had his to rememorialize him. He had to rememorialize Xander. And so he drew his approximation of a 3-year-old C and a Z on his 2 front fingers, and then started drawing extra letters for baby sister. And for the baby sister, he insists he has in his belly. Also, because mirroring is a thing, not his last 2 fingers. But I think it's really kind and wonderful that he still thinks about him independent of us bringing him up, and that he still feels like it's a big part of kind of his own story and what that looks like. And we talk a lot about like the things that we enjoyed and the joy we had with Xander. We have pictures of him up on our wall. So every time he goes up and down the different stairs in our DC row house, like he'll stop sometimes and point to pictures mainly of Caspian holding Xander. We have a lot of those on the wall. And then he'll talk about it. And I think that creating that space is something that's just really important to me, so that we're there for him and present for him if he needs us. And we don't act like that's something that didn't happen, because it did. And it impacted a lot around kind of our arc of our family and our story. And I don't think we'd be having a baby girl right now, less than a year later, if it wasn't for that. So we think about, we think about him every day, and Caspian talks about him a lot. And we just try to make that space.
How could you not think about him every day? Well, so it's interesting. We're talking a lot about how you're supporting a toddler in understanding big concepts like grief, and how you're keeping this memory alive in your family unit as a whole. It is true that people grieve differently, and that some relationships find the grief process to be, a point of friction. Mm-hmm. Do you and your husband have a similar approach to grieving? Have you had to navigate independent grieving versus grieving as a couple? Can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like?
I think that each person seeks out different kinds of support. For me, I've found a lot of comfort in the shared experience with strangers who are now dear friends, who also went through loss, for example. An old coworker of mine connected me to his sister who'd lost a daughter 7 years ago, but had gone through losing a daughter when she had other older children, including a 3-year-old. And I spent a lot of time in long text message conversations with this person I'd never actually even spoken to on the phone. And I find a lot of comfort in that. My husband spent a lot more time with his existing friends and friend group who were there to support him, rather than being as wrapped up in kind of a new community of infant lost dads. And I think that as you think about the experience of a mother and a father, the supports that we have, the social supports that wrap around those different roles and those different people, are very different. There's a lot out there to support and wrap around a mom. Like, there's a lot of support out there. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of support groups. There's a lot of different conversations you can tap into. There's less for dads, I think. And I don't know that that's really fair, because I think that they feel the loss just as acutely and deeply. It's just different for them, especially when you think about someone who's like a 3-month-old, and I can't speak to this, but if someone had a stillborn baby or a miscarriage, if you're the person who was carrying that child, you knew them just for longer. They were there and part of you for a longer period of time. And so I feel like I got to know and kind of hold and have Xander for a whole year, whereas others only knew him for the couple of months that he was here, including his dad, who had a wonderful relationship with him. And he was such a joyful, giggly, happy baby, just have his chunky little cheeks just bounced around. And James always enjoyed making him do little dances and things like that. I don't know if you're familiar with the ring theory in psychology around support and grief, the idea that the most bereaved people in the center of the circle. So the idea that would probably in this case be the parents, if it's a child that you lost. And as you move out the rings, you move further and further away from the loss itself to people who maybe were more kind of other family acquaintances. Like the grandparents are usually the next ring out, and the siblings, and then moving further out, you've got the aunts or the uncles. And the idea is that if you are further out on the rings, you may only send care and support inwards, And you cannot burden people with extra asks or questions or things like that. And the further you are towards the center, you can ask for anything you need and say whatever you want towards the people further out from the loss. And I think one of the challenges is that for other groups that are beyond just the immediate family, like grandparents, I know my mom has had a lot of challenges processing this loss and losing a grandchild. She'd spend time out here when he was born. She came back out again in August. We went out to Lake Anna and spent a weekend there. Like, she has had a lot of time with them, more than a lot of people did. And I remember chatting with her near the end of the first month after he was gone, so getting close to Halloween. And she still couldn't say his name on the phone without bursting into tears. And there's a certain forcing function forward with a toddler with Caspian that you just are there to support him. And so you have to find a path forward. You don't have another choice. Like, it felt like the worst thing in the world if I abandoned the time and the space I had with my surviving child because I lost my other, and to lose out on that with him would be even worse. And so my mom came back out for Halloween and got dressed up in galaxy and star things with us because we have a star named after Xander that my mom and dad picked out for us and had named for him. So we leaned in on the star theme really hard, and Caspian went as an astronaut.
It's so beautiful. And it's interesting because I'd never heard that theory of the concentric rings going out. It actually puts so much into perspective, not just for grief and loss, but how and when to ask for and take up space. I think we're so afraid sometimes to say, what are my needs, and are my needs valid? And that theory sort of says, there are times when your needs are so valid, you need to lean into them and express them and say, ask for help, or feel like you have the capacity to do what you need to do for yourself. And there are times when you should not be pressuring somebody else with, or burdening them with your needs.
Find a different way to direct the need, right?
Exactly.
Like, you're not asking the right person. Like, it's not that your needs are invalid. Maybe you're a center of a different circle somewhere else, right? But in this kind of network of people, that's not the direction you should be sending your needs and wants and requests. And I feel deeply for people like my mom who, work really hard to respect my boundaries and not ask for anything. But there was a certain point I'm like, no, like, I want you to also be supported. Like, there are things I can do that make things a little bit easier or better. And I would like to do them for you because that's important, because I've had the space and time to do that. And the support structures that were really helpful.
What were some of those things you did for your mom?
I did a little kids book of sorts with stories, like a kind of little story about Caspian and Xander together. And I sent her a copy of that. And I know she showed to a lot of people. That has helped her just kind of explain like their closeness and their bond. And I know she's just had people read that little picture storybook. And one of the things I think has been the most interesting is I think we've furthered our own conversations around needs and wants and boundaries in really good ways that I've gotten better at saying, here's what I need or don't need right now, and trying to find the right balance of being direct, but also being kind. I think it's been healthy and good for us. I think there are things we haven't quite dug into yet, but I think also reinforced some of the interesting and different experiences that we've had from my experience going through both grief, loss, and some of the issues that we had in like the week and weeks that followed that centered on kind of misuse of social media and misrepresentation of our story. And my parents aren't on social media at all. And so it was a very interesting time to talk with them about that experience, which maybe we can dive into a little bit. And the very different way that was lived out for them, and my dad going and digging down a rabbit hole of anti-vaccine blogs and the maelstrom of comments that sat on those that had very specific opinions about me as a parent and a mother.
Yeah. I want to dive into that. You have written many very powerful articles, but one in particular in the New York Times about your experience after losing your son, and when your narrative did not become your own. Somebody co-opted your narrative and spread misinformation. Can you tell us a little bit tell us what that was all about, and then we'll dive into some of the
Sure.
key elements.
So I think it's important to reinforce that I have this weird intersection of being a public health professional and a parent and a lost parent and someone who works on demystifying data and trying to make people make sense of data. So I talked a lot in the pandemic about all the issues with misinformation and all the issues with kind of the infodemic we had happening that WHO talked about. Back when I got vaccinated, when I was talking publicly about the fact that I made the choice to get vaccinated, and here's why. In consultation with my doctor, made that decision, and would do it over again. No questions asked. It was absolutely the right decision. And I shared the tweet about my son died unexpectedly. Really sad. Hug your kids, something like that. Like hug your kids tighter tonight for me. And I expected that people would see that who maybe were like my Twitter friends. I have a pretty good kind of tech network of people on Twitter and other spaces. And it would just prevent me from having to answer questions about how's your baby doing. And instead, that got like 20,000 likes and reshares and started getting a lot of kind of quote tweets and comments about like, oh, well, what do you think really happened? Died unexpectedly, and speculating about what that might look like. And someone took it upon themselves to go ahead and track down an admission on my side stating that I had been vaccinated while I was pregnant, and paired together 2 public-facing tweets of mine saying, I got vaccinated while I was pregnant, and I'm really glad to provide this protection and immunity to my kids. So someone paired that comment along with the sharing of my son dying with some overlaid text around functionally like, this caused that. This is a causal link between these 2 things. And obviously, because she got vaccinated in pregnancy is why her son died. That is factually inaccurate and not true. That does not have anything to do with my son's loss or my son's death. But it's easier for people to go ahead and lift and shift that kind of content and manufacture their own stories and anecdotes and information that are compelling and scary and thought-provoking and really draw on your emotions if you're a pregnant woman trying to make a decision around whether you get vaccinated in pregnancy, which may feel like something that's a really untested environment and space. And that meme, that anti-vax meme of sorts, also took off and went viral and got shared over and over and over again, including as a response quite frequently to comments and recommendations from the CDC, because the CDC had put out their stronger guidelines recommending vaccination in pregnancy for COVID-19 for women the exact same week that my son died on a Sunday, and the anti-vax meme popped up on a Monday, and the recommendations, I think, had come out on Tuesday. And so that moved very quickly. And by Wednesday, I had had about 24 hours of calls and conversations with both some health social media type influencers who had dealt with doxing and trolling and other issues in the past, as well as working with some tech friends of mine who were helping me find anywhere that my personally identifiable information, my phone number, my email, things like that were accessible to get them scraped off the internet. Because I was 3 days out from having lost my son and spending a lot of mental time and energy just trying to make sure that my family didn't get targeted, harassed, or hurt in that period. And I remember sitting at a pumpkin patch outside of DC on Tuesday. They died on a Sunday. On Tuesday, when things were starting to blow up, and I've gotten some emails from friends who had anti-vax family members who were like, so your picture showed up on my sister-in-law's social feed, like talking about how this mom got what she deserved for the fact that her son died because she got vaccinated. And other really abhorrent comments that are not quite fit for a podcast or for print.
I just want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. So your son has recently passed. I mean, so fresh, it hasn't even been a week. You're dealing with the raw, extreme pain and emotion, and people are attacking you on social media as though you caused his death. And you're now worried for your whole family's safety, that they might find your information online and come after you in some way. Is that what you were living in that week?
I spoke to, by Tuesday, I had started talking to multiple lawyers and an InfoSec expert who helped me with ideas and suggestions on personal protections. On Wednesday morning, I picked up my parents from the airport who flew in because we were doing a small memorial for Xander that following Saturday. Picked them up from the airport, and on the way from the airport, as we stopped in a Michael's parking lot to pick up impression molding kits to take handprints and footprints before our son was cremated. Got a call from a friend who said she found my email somewhere else, and I needed to go ahead and get online and pull another document off of a website as I'm sitting in a Michael's parking lot. And that was how that week was spent, was this odd combination of planning a remembrance ceremony for our son who had passed away, dealing with things like cremation arrangements, and once the medical examiner had finished their medical examination, and dealing with daily issues related to harassment and resharing of this that felt so out of control. Like you just feel so violated because your story is being misrepresented so extremely, and for something that you feel so strongly personally that you don't believe in personally and professionally, that is just factually inaccurate. And to be called a murderer and worse around just related to your own decision to get vaccinated or to encourage other people to do so is a lot to have piled on to a really emotional time as you're lightly pumping breast milk because you're trying to kind of slowly wean yourself off of the fact that your child had been breastfeeding and your body still thought there should be a baby there. There was just a lot happening during that week. And thankfully, a friend of mine stepped in on Thursday. So Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Took the day off work and took over all my social media accounts and started content moderating them and screenshotting and documenting all of the different harassing pieces and starting to try to put pieces together to get some of the images taken down and some of the different posts and things like that. And functionally kind of continued to content moderate my social media for the better part of a month. And one of the hardest things there is like, that sounds like one of those things where it's like, just ignore it, let it slow burn and it'll go away. And the two things that I was reminded of by folks who work with misinformation issues and deal especially with anti-vaccine communities is these kind of things might slow burn and go away for a while, and then they'll just pop back up. Someone will reshare it. It'll pop back up. It'll come back in some way, shape, or form. And the second issue is that you miss out on all of the messages of support and care and looking back through old messages and things, messages from other lost parents who reached out to me and were offering support and ideas, suggestions, articles, just if you ever need to talk to someone, please feel free to reach out to me type messages. And you miss all of that and all of that space as you're sitting in a pandemic, grieving the loss of your child, barely around anyone that you're close with. You miss out on that too. And so it's a really hard space to be in the sense you've kind of been cut off from one of the social spaces where you could engage with friends and find that kind of support. You have the reality that you don't know how to make this thing really slow burn out, not flare up and come back. And on the top of everything else, I was personally and professionally worried about the fact that I knew that people seeing this kind of content is what actually can fuel people to make healthcare seeking decisions or not. And it really pains me to think that like this misuse of my story was influencing people in a direction that would be negative for the health of their self and their baby. And so we were advised, to your original question on how things change over 4 months, I was advised by lawyers and by communications folks that until I had the autopsy results that said it wasn't vaccine related, that I would just be fueling the fire and having people poke at me and ask me questions I couldn't formally and officially answer. And in COVID, it takes 4 months-ish to get an autopsy. So I waited until I had the confirmation that his death had nothing to do with vaccine. And at that point, started to think about how I wanted to approach sharing my side of the story and prioritizing sharing that story in a space that I thought would have wide reach. And hopefully, my biggest hope was to have that story reach at least a few of the kinds of concerned grandparents or pregnant women who see these kind of stories and genuinely get concerned because you worry that maybe this is true. I might know in my heart of hearts that this probably isn't true, but maybe this is true. And on the off chance that it is, why would I put my precious child at risk? So that was why I chose to finally write something in such a public-facing space.
It's so interesting because what I'm hearing you say, I'm reminded of the concentric circles again, right? Where at the very core of the circle is this grief and loss, and that should be enough for one person to deal with over the course of a week, a year, a lifetime. And yet then the next circle is I've got to protect my family from these people who are attacking us on social media, and they may make those threats real. And then there's the concentric circle of professionally and morally, ethically, I believe in vaccines and I don't want anyone to read my story or read the misinformation about my story and make a choice based on that, based on misinformation. I mean, so you're simultaneously dealing with the very micro and the very macro. It just seems so unfair for one person to hold all at once.
It felt cathartic to write something about it and put something out there. And I'm very grateful to the folks who I worked with at the New York Times, who the editor, the photographer who came to my house on Mother's Day and took a picture of me for it. And especially even to their fact checkers who are exceptionally thorough, line by line by line, checking to make sure that every single verifiable fact about the timeline of events that I present there, about my conversations, everything else is validated. And so to be able to say and go on the paper of record was important for me there. And one of the things I really am just continuously struck by is this issue of consent and how kind of our content and everything else gets used and whether you've given consent or not. And one of the most interesting pieces of feedback I got from one council I talked to, who were all very kind to talk to me just giving some informal advice basis, was that because of the fact that I had written so much about the pandemic and COVID related data, including about vaccine data and like demystifying vaccine data, that in the context of how my story was being misrepresented, I would be considered a limited use public figure. And that removes some of my individual rights to privacy related to some of these stories and different pieces. So I have a formal government copyright on the photo of my boys that was in the tweet, so it can get taken down from an IP perspective. But the idea that I don't have the rights to how that gets shared or manufactured or reshared or packaged in some way, shapes, or forms. And so you can report those kind of things as misinformation, but I've lost some of my own rights to privacy because of the professional field that I sit in. And so it comes in this big whole full circle around the ways in which the things that I cared so deeply about and still do and still talk about publicly ended up being challenging there. And when I put the New York Times piece out that I got lots of really kind notes and feedback about, I had so many people who asked for my permission if they could share it. And it just felt like it was in such conflict and just so divergent from the experience of someone co-opting something and spreading and sharing something that was factually inaccurate and a lie and manufactured and causing you to be targeted with a lot of this kind of hate and vitriol. And that people who cared about me and knew me personally, I published it in the New York Times. Like, of course, please share it. I wouldn't have published it in the New York Times if I didn't want it to be shared. Would ask for my consent just to make sure it was okay, because they knew that this was a whole experience that was really challenging for me personally and professionally. And it really struck me around the ways in which we treat strangers on the internet so differently and with so much less empathy and kindness than how we treat the people who we know personally.
And I mentioned this, I just can't get over the irony of being the person who demystifies information and you're the one who's targeted with a misinformation attack. You know, that you're so conscientious in your profession by your career is to give us information in distilled, accurate, easily digestible ways. And yet your content, your life story, your tragedy was spun in this way.
Who better to go ahead and get really pissed off and angry about it, though? I mean, the two things that I lean into a lot as part of writing the New York Times story, I've connected with a lot of other lost parents who have had their stories and their content misused in the same way, but who don't have the same public health background and who don't have that same platform, and to be able to go out and email someone they know at the New York Times and say, I really want to write about this. Is this something that your opinions would consider? That they don't have the access to those kind of platforms and spaces, and maybe second guess themselves a little bit more just because of those circles and swirls of information and misinformation around them. So I feel like I have the professional backing to be able to say, I can fight this, and I think that this is wrong. I know this is wrong and inaccurate, and I'm willing to put my voice on the line around that. And in some ways that was cathartic, better than being angry at the world for this thing that you didn't understand why it happened to you and your family. So I mean, it gave me a really easy place to just feel really angry at a very specific group of people for a while for the ways in which they misrepresented my story.
Yeah. And not just misrepresented. I mean, we're talking about the misrepresentation because it is so extreme in the context of what you do and in the context of the data that you work with. And you, if I'm hearing you correctly, and I think I am, you're saying definitively, we know that there was no link between a vaccine and your son's death.
No, I got a booster shot in pregnancy with this little girl right now and feel fully confident in that decision as well. We have so much data, so much population level data from studies looking at, the most recent one had more than 56,000 pregnancies tracked in it. And looking at the use of COVID-19 vaccines, the safety profiles, everything else, and looking at the protective effects that you get if you're vaccinated in pregnancy for your infant or newborn. Similar to how we recommend Tdap shots in pregnancy. And I mean, every single time you're pregnant, you get a Tdap shot. It's not because you need more protection from pertussis. It's because of the fact that the best way to protect your child against whooping cough in those first 2 months is to get vaccinated while you're pregnant, because you get that conferred immunity. And we now know that you get some of that from COVID-19 when you're vaccinated in pregnancy. And so I have only seen the data bear out more and more evidence when it's actually correctly interpreted and represented, which we know is not always the case with VAERS data and other ways in which things get cherry picked. But we know and have much better data now showing the safety and efficacy of COVID vaccines in pregnancy. And that's why ACOG, that's why the CDC, that's why so many other bodies strongly recommend them for pregnant women, just because you're at higher risk and because it affects your fetus. And I am glad that that has been borne out in the data. I understand why people were more vaccine hesitant back in April and March when I got vaccinated in 2021, when it was newer and there was less data. I understand that. But just because someone else's medical decision was different than yours, and I chose to go ahead and take that path, I don't think that that should ever be the reason for targeting and hatred and accusations and unkindness in the ways in which it was directed at me and my family.
Let's just imagine for a second that we were still in this place where we didn't know enough data about whether vaccines work or don't work. Let's say we were really, truly uncertain, just for a second. Even if the data proved the other way, even if the data proved that vaccines were maybe harmful, there is no excuse for targeting somebody who has lost a loved one and saying it's your fault, you're a murderer, or any of the other things that you had to hear. There's no excuse for piling on pain to somebody who's experiencing loss, even if you're certain that you're right. And in this case, the data proves that you're not right. It's unfathomable to me that somebody would feel like it was their place to shame you around your loss.
One of the things I heard from some folks too was, I'm not the one calling someone names. I'm not tagging you. I'm just resharing the information because I think it's interesting that someone knows it. And it's that interesting kind of strange edge case of someone who doesn't see themselves as the bad guy. They see themselves as a truth teller, or someone who's just sharing the things that aren't being shared by the mainstream media. And I've talked to a lot of misinformation researchers now who've been very helpful in terms of how we frame and talk about these kind of stories. And at the end of the day, I don't think that my speaking out, writing in the New York Times, talking to you today, in any other context, is going to change the minds of people who are very resolutely in a belief system of believing that vaccines are something that we should not be using, especially in the context of pregnancy. I do think that there are a lot of people who see these kind of stories and don't think of themselves as really causing harm to that family because they're not the ones tagging someone directly. They're not the one calling them a certain name. But just by amplifying that story and giving it a boost and having it move through more social circles and social networks, you create opportunities for the people who do have more nefarious ideas around how they would like to address the bereaved family. You do create more opportunities for them to be targeted and be hurt and be harmed and be yelled at and be hated on. And so I think it's really important to remember that even if you're not the one directly out there saying, you know, one of the comments was the blood of all the dead babies are on your hands from the COVID vaccine. But when you're the one amplifying that kind of information without validating that it's accurate and correct, I think that it's really important to remember that we all end up playing a role in that and that it really does impact real people's lives.
I'm going to get the terminology for this theory wrong, but it's that bystander effect, right? If there's a crime happening or there's something horrific happening in your vicinity physically, let's say we were at the park together and we witnessed something. By not doing anything, we're complicit in the crime.
There's also an interest, and I don't know the phrase, there's a really interesting kind of phenomenon in how bad things happen and how people experience them and what their perception is about bad things happen to bad people who obviously did something wrong, because it makes people feel more like that same bad thing can't happen to them. And it is really interesting to me thinking about that idea that if you can point to and say, the reason that she lost her baby is because she made this choice and I made a different choice, which means that really bad thing can't happen to me and my family, is something that we do as a kind of protective mental effect in terms of something we do this to protect ourselves so that we don't have to worry about that terrible thing happening to us. And the reality is that things happen, bad things happen to good people all the time. And I think that it's really hard sometimes because you want to think that there's something you can do that keeps you from being the one that really, really, really bad thing happens to.
That resonates with me so much because, for starters, infant loss is one of those things that we have no sense for why it happens in many cases. And that's extremely scary. And I personally relate to it because my son is approximately the same age as the son you lost. And they share a lot in common, actually. And our shared friend, Kristen, told me about your story at a time when my pregnancy, postpartum, my hormones were going bananas. And so I very much sat with your story before meeting you with a sense of fear, like, oh my God, this can happen to anyone. This is so scary. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to make this about me, but it is terrifying to have no answer and nothing that you can say, I'm protected, I'm okay. So I get why you would say, oh, this person must be bad, or they must have made a bad choice, or they must have done this horrible thing. And it is both not true and exceedingly harmful to re-traumatize somebody who has experienced something painful and horrible.
I mean, I've heard the same thing from other people though, Julia, about like, once you know somebody who seems so similar to you in whatever way, right? Like whether it's demographics or education or something else that seems so similar to you that loses a child. And we saw this talking to friends of ours who went through pregnancy and had a baby after we lost Ander, that knowing someone it happened to just makes it feel so much more possible than when it's a set of kind of statistics of 21,000 babies in America that are kind of babies. They're babies. They don't have names and faces and pictures in the same way that someone who you know who can talk about their child and talk about their giggles and talk about their laughter and has a similar timeline and chubby cheeks and everything else. It's just different. And I know that I've talked to friends about the fact that it's created different levels of anxiety for them with their newborns, around their kind of protective effect around their kids. And I appreciate that people acknowledge that our loss impacted them in different ways. I also appreciate your comment of, I'm not trying to center myself and make it feel like this is worse than what you went through.
Well, we sort of talked about my experience with anxiety around, oh, now I have this tiny newborn and something could happen to that newborn. But that's me. It's not this story. You are now going to have a tiny newborn. Mm-hmm. How are you preparing yourself for any anticipatory anxiety? Are you anxious about having a newborn?
I've got really strict COVID rules around people seeing her and meeting her in terms of who will see her in those first couple of months, just because of not wanting to take any chances. And I go to group therapy regularly and have a therapist, and that's also very helpful. So I think having someone who is a neutral party, where when my anxiety is flaring up in different ways and I'm getting nervous about different things, my husband also gets nervous about different things, right? And I think it's wonderful to be able to talk about those things sometimes. It's also really good to have someone who I can just go to and talk about all of the different challenges and anxieties I'm feeling about the baby in a space that they can help me process what those feelings look like. And I think that having a separate neutral space for that for me is really helpful.
It's great advice for anyone who might be going through this. Now that you've been talking about how COVID impacts families, now that you've experienced 3 pregnancies, soon to be 3 newborns, and this loss, has it shaped the way you think about family? You know, how does your definition of family feel right now?
One of the most interesting changes that I didn't realize was going to be hard is that the very normal question of how many kids do you have is really painful now in ways that it wasn't. And it's no one's fault when they ask me that question, especially someone I just met or a stranger. It's very normal for someone to see me out with my son and be like, oh, is he your only? Oh, is this your second? When they see that I'm pregnant. And so it has made me more mindful that someone's shape of what their family looks like may not be what their family physically looks like right now. And that could mean children who have left or moved on. That could mean foster children they had for a long time who are still kind of part of their extended family unit and have moved on. That could be you lost a child. And when people ask how many kids I have, I always say 2, and I'm having a 3rd. Because I did. I had 2 kids, and now I'm going to have a 3rd. And in some ways, it makes it easier to talk about Caspian as the oldest and baby girl as the youngest, and just leave it be at that, and not need to go in great depth or detail. But I do think it shaped my feelings around how we talk about family and how those different questions, those seemingly innocuous questions, actually might be really hard for someone to answer, and what that looks like. And that the shape of different families might just look different for different people. I also think that the thing that it's done for me is just reinforce just the immense amount of empathy that kids can have watching my toddler go through this kind of loss. And I'm really excited. He's so excited to have a baby in the house again. He's obsessed with babies, obsessed with reading books about having babies and all those different things. So I'm excited to give him that space and time again. And I'm also struck by both how much you can hold two feelings at the same time. And I think that that goes beyond just grief and goes into parenting. And that one of the things that I know I've talked about a lot with my therapist in different spaces is like you can hold two feelings at the same time. You can both be really joyful and excited about having this new baby girl and also be super anxious about it or feel a lot of immense amount of loss because you don't want to ever feel like she was here to replace Xander because she's not. She's another baby in our family.
Well, if somebody wants to talk to you, maybe they're experiencing a loss and they need somebody who's been through it, or maybe they're curious to read some of the incredible publications that you've put out there. How do we find you?
So you can find me either for looking for writing and publications and some of the data viz stuff I do. You can find me on my personal website, which is just my name, Makulec.com. I also do a lot of tweeting and sharing on Twitter around different topics related to both grief and loss, but really more related to public health and data visualization. So I was happy to connect with folks there. You can always go ahead and message me either on the contact form on my website or my DMs are gated, but I do take a peek at them. If you want to take a peek at those over on Twitter. So those are the best ways to get in touch with me.
Why are they gated?
I don't know. Why would I not want to let anyone flood my inbox with really angry, mean things? Why do I not just put my email out on the internet anymore instead of using a contact form? Who knows?
No, and I'll put this out too. If you're listening and you've got a heartfelt and kind question, you can reach out to Stork'd and I will send it to Amanda if appropriate.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.